Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muniz.
Welcome to the MCAT podcast, or the Jack Westin MCAT podcast, I should specify. My name is Phil Hawkins, the MCAT director here at Jack Westin, and person who went to med school. Here with my co-host, Azaii.
Hey everyone, my name is Azaii Muniz. Currently in medical school, so you're going to get a couple different perspectives during this podcast, but very excited to continue. Today we have a very special topic. If you were with us last week, you might have heard us talking about exams and practice exams. So today we're going to talk about how to review those exams.
Yeah. Exam review is like how well students review exams is probably like the biggest thing that I think students should do better at. Like if there's one thing that I could just like blanket statement, students need to work harder on this thing as they're prepping, it's probably reviewing exams. Just as a point to discuss, probably the most successful student that I've worked with in terms of like increasing their scores. I had a student who went from a 496 to a 520. So that they increased their score by 24 points. And we only spent like about 3.5 months. The thing that student did that really raised their score more than any of the other students that I'd worked with was he was so good at reviewing. And he would review really well, very thoroughly. And so I think that overall, the reviewing portion is a portion of the exam that students tend to neglect. They tend to not put in as much time on that as they should. They take an exam and then they like review the exam later that day. And I think that is probably not the best way to do that kind of overall. Azaii, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the last thing you want to do is review an exam the same day you took the exam. Again, it is a long exam. You are probably exhausted, right? You probably need a nap and to eat after taking that exam. The last thing you're going to be able to do is effectively review if you're tired, if you are just drained. And so I usually recommend waiting a bit. That said, you're not going to wait, an entire week before reviewing your exam, because at that point, you're not really going to remember how you thought about the questions. You may not remember, the passage, et cetera. So for some students, you're going to be able to review the next day or, the day after, and then you're going to split up your review so that you're not, bogged down and doing a 12, 14-hour review for some students in an entire day in one sitting.
Yeah. Overall, I think reviewing the exam should take as long or longer than taking the exam. Now, the first time you take an exam and you review it, it should probably take much longer to review the exam than it took to take the exam. As you get a little bit later, like if you took an exam and you got like a 525, it probably isn't going to take you that long to review it because your thought processes are exactly in line with how they should be. But that like this kind of like big picture of like what are your goals when you're reviewing, I think is really critical. I keep wanting to talk about this student, but he was so good at reviewing. And I think that one of the things that he responded to and things that he understood as I was talking to him was that we're not reviewing the questions, right? Like as you go through and you review, you're not reviewing the questions, you're reviewing yourself. Like you're reviewing, what was I thinking? And this is why when you said like, you don't want to wait a week, I absolutely think you should probably try to review your exam the next day or the day after. Because if you go long enough, all of a sudden you don't really remember what you were thinking when you saw this question. And that is critically important. What I recommend students to do when they're reviewing an exam, make like an Excel document or Google Sheets for free. If you don't have Excel, because the whole Word package can be really expensive from Microsoft, you can always use Google Sheets. Go through and have like question 1, did I get it right? Or was it correct or incorrect? And then what I have my students do is I want them to write down, how did I think to answer this question? And then how did the AAMC think when they were answering this question? And those are two different things. It's very often that a student will get the right answer here on a question, but they weren't thinking the way that the AAMC was trying to approach this. Like, let's say they ask a question, they give you a bunch of data and they ask you like, what's the buoyancy or what's the density of blood? And I just know blood's about the same as water, so it's got to be about the density of water, which is B, and then move on. But if they wanted you to do this calculation of like putting these different things together, then you need to recognize like, okay, the way I was thinking about this is not wrong. And I do think that is still useful to find those shortcuts, those back doors to questions of like, it's still got to be around blood. But you also want to make sure that you can think about it the way that the AAMC writers want you to think about it. So this is very time consuming because you sit down and you write like, what was I thinking? What were they thinking? And that takes a lot of time to kind of go through and do that for all of the 230 questions. Now, I want to be clear here. I do think that you should do them for all the questions. Now, even the questions you got right, you can put like the AAMC thought this, I was thinking the same. And that's fine. Just like ditto, right? For what would be your notes on that. But I do think it is important for you to recognize that, especially the questions you got wrong, but also the questions you got right. And in that realm of the questions you got right, you also need to look at which questions took me a while to answer, because maybe I got the right answer, but I wasn't making connections like quick enough. And like it didn't seem obvious to me that I should be using kinetic energy instead of kinematics. And so I was like trying to solve this for a while. And so you want to like spend some time trying to figure out, how could I have answered this quicker? What should I have noticed and paid attention to in order to do this? Now, note that what I'm talking about here is like, what should I have done, right? So this is why when you're reviewing yourself. You're trying to figure out like, what could I have done better? How should I have looked at this question? How should I have ruled out that wrong answer that I found so tempting? And that takes time, but that is absolutely the way that you grow, because instead of just looking at the questions and like what was the right and wrong answer and then moving on, you're looking at like, how could I have handled this question better? Once again, even the questions you got right. And that's what the student does or did. And that's what all the students that I work with, what I try to instill in them as they're reviewing is it's more of a review of yourself and how could I have handled something better? Honestly, that's a skill that I think is probably a good skill to work on in your entire life. Anytime anything doesn't go well, just stop and be like, I'm not trying to assign blame, but how could I have handled this situation? What could I have done differently to get a different outcome? And that's where that kind of growth side of things kind of comes in.
I have so many thoughts on this topic. This is such a rich topic. There's a part of me during these conversations, because our podcasts are just conversations, right?
Yeah.
That I want to take notes because I have so many thoughts and I want to make sure that I get them out. So we're hitting at the overarching idea of how to, or the overarching strategies of how to review exams. I also every so often want to think in or bring in something a little bit more granular. So you mentioned that spreadsheet, right? And so something that I also like to have students do is for your purposes, aggregate data, your purposes of reviewing and finding patterns throughout exams, is have a line where you have a single word that says why you missed that question, right? Yeah. So content, the, missing details in the passage, data analysis, et cetera, right? Yeah. And then this is something where a lot of students, they default to content. And so they'll say, oh, I missed this question because of content, but you could have found that information in a figure, right? And so making sure that you're very honest with yourself. We talked about accountability last time, but making sure that you're really honest with yourself about why you're missing questions is important. And the reason I like having a single column for that is because then I can scroll, right? And see how often one of those reasons came up. And so I can say, okay. Data. Yes. And so I can say, okay, in Chem Phys, right, I'm struggling a lot more with equations, calculations. And so that's a hint that, hey, instead of, sitting down and trying to read the new, like a scientific journal, which don't really recommend for studying for the MCAT. But I can say, okay, I need to actually go back and review some arithmetic because most of us haven't done math without a calculator in a while, right? So that's a good way to orient, your future plans for studying. Something else that I like to do personally, and this is not, something that every student will do or needs to do, is if I'm, or I guess I should in the past, if I found myself taking an absurd amount of time for a specific question, I'd put an asterisk and I would say, okay, I see that I'm doing that a lot more in this section with these types of questions. And then I know when I take that next exam or do that next practice passage, that those are the questions that I'm prone to losing track of time. And so I'm going to be stricter with myself with these types of questions in the future, right? Because we've talked about this. You don't want to spend, 5 minutes on a question and then miss out on 4 other questions that you could have answered that were easier points for you. So that's another way to approach reviewing your full lengths. And then something else that I think is useful is reviewing the full lengths, the sections of the full length in the order that you did them. So I've, encountered students who they'll want to jump around sections, right? But if you're trying to remember how you were thinking about different questions and different sections, it's useful to kind of go back into that environment, right? And say, okay, I did ChemPhys first and then I did CARS. And something else that students will do is that they won't review each section. And so this psych-soc gets shortchanged a lot.
Yeah.
And so making sure that you are thorough with your review of each section will be helpful, because even if you're already great at a section, there are probably still points that you can gain in that section that will boost your overall score. So if you're already solid in that section, why not add those extra points, right? And bring your entire score up. So keeping track of aggregate data, useful, right? Looking for patterns, useful. And then giving each of the sections some love, useful.
Yeah. And I think it's really important. So to just be I want to be really clear here. So when I'm working with the students, the columns, what's the question number? Was I correct? What did the AAMC think? What did I think? And then exactly like you said, what I did wrong, or where my problem was. And it might be content. It could be a lot of things, right? I can have 10 students all miss the same question for different reasons. And I think that it's really important for you to get really granular here. Mm-hmm. You need to go in and if you missed a question that was about electrostatics and it was a calculation and you missed it, did you miss, don't just write content. First off, write electrostatics. Secondly, figure out, did I miss it because it was a math error? Mm-hmm. Did I miss it because I didn't know the electrostatics equations? Did I miss it because I know my electrostatics equations, but I didn't know which one to use, right? And those are 3 different problems, right? And you need to figure out, and none of those have anything to do with the passage. Those are all things that are kind of just you, right? Your math errors, your knowledge, your stuff. Obviously, questions can also be problems with data interpretation, or I didn't understand the passage, or timing, right? At the end of the exam, if you only had 1 minute to do 2 passages, you're going to miss questions due to timing. Mm-hmm. And so by the end of this, you're going to have a list, right? You're going to have this overarching kind of list of what the issues were. And so you'll note hey, I missed 3 questions about kidney stuff because I just didn't know my kidney content. I missed 4 questions due to math errors, and I missed 6 questions due to data interpretation issues. So using this, I need to work on data interpretation. So this week, I'm going to be working on data interpretation. I'm going to review my math stuff, make sure I know how to deal with scientific notation and logarithms, which hurt me, and then review kidney stuff. And so once you get into that area where you're approaching your test day, this is generally how I would advocate a schedule for a student. You take a test on Saturday, you review it on Sunday and Monday. Mm-hmm. Tuesday through Thursday, you are just hitting whatever that exam said you need to hit. So if that exam said you need to work on data interpretation, you're doing a lot of passages, working on a lot of data interpretation. And then Friday, take a day off. Saturday, take another test. And that way, each week you are getting better than you were the week before. You're diagnosing your weak areas and then you're treating them. This is absolutely what happens in a hospital, right? Somebody doesn't come in and say, I'm sick, and you give them a pill and they're better. You got to figure out what's wrong with them first. You have to diagnose and then treat. And it's very much the same thing as you're prepping for the MCAT and doing these exams. These exams are yes, it's important to do exams to figure out scores, but these exams are the best diagnostic tool you have. They will help you find what are your weak areas and then go hit those, treat those weak areas. And then eventually, if you do an exam like every week, by the end of like 3 or 4 weeks, you don't have weak areas because each exam has been telling you, you need to work on this, you need to work on this, and that builds up. Just a side note is, even though the exams are long, they're not long enough to cover all the topics on the MCAT, which is why the MCAT is so difficult and why we have job security, because it's just so difficult. So on one exam might have a lot of optics questions, the next exam might not. And so this is why it's important to do this over multiple exams, because if you take one exam and you didn't miss anything on optics, you might think that you're good on optics, even though the real reason you didn't miss any questions was just because they didn't ask any. So you need kind of like multiple exams to find those weak areas, kind of across the board. Like 3 or 4 exams is needed to like hit kind of everything, and be able to bring those weak areas up to the point where you don't have those weak areas. Yeah.
And something that came to mind, which is something that will also matter in medical school, always making those connections, is a lot of students saying this is going to take forever. Like you're talking about a day, maybe 2 days. This is going to take me all week, right? Those are often the students that are writing full sentences. Those are often the students that are copying and pasting entire chunks of content and then writing more on that content in this, review. And we don't want you to do that, right? We don't want this review to be 1, 2, 3 paragraphs for every question. That's not what this is about, right? So use bullet points, use shorthand, have a system that you set up in the beginning that's, just shorthand, right? And that way you can have that consistency across exams, shorten your review time, and really target that review time towards finding those patterns, towards identifying what you need to work on.
For example, like if you missed a question that they tried to use the kinematic or the kinetic energies equations for, and you use kinematics, just wrote like their thought process was kinetic energy and yours was I tried to use kinematics and it didn't work because the acceleration wasn't constant. That's your notes, right? And I do want to be clear here. It is gonna take a long time regardless, but you can try to bring it down. Generally, 10 hours is not unusual for a student to review an exam. And so even with the shorthand, it still can take a while.
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't interrupt. I just wanted to give an example to clarify.
Yeah, and absolutely. A couple of other things. So something that I did that I found super helpful once I reviewed my exams, and do not make the same mistakes that, I made and that Phil made. One mistake that I made was not taking enough time at the beginning to review my exams because I said, I don't know all of the content yet. So it doesn't really matter what I review. It still matters when you take those earlier exams. So you are going to take some exams when you haven't, mastered all of the content. Again, we're saying mastered, but recognizing that you won't truly master all of the content, and that's okay. You still want to review those exams and recognize that you're still going through content. So you still have to review the content that you're studying in terms of your study schedule. And as you get closer to test day, as you're working and hitting that last third where you're just doing a lot of questions, a lot of application, that's when you're really going to be able to take, 2-3 days to review all of the content that you missed and review all of the strategies that you are still struggling with. So keep that in mind, that there is some, difference in how you review each exam as you progress throughout your study schedule. And then something that I found super helpful was after I did all of that, I would have, and I'm someone that I handwrite. Even in medical school, I can't type and keep track of everything. So something that I found super useful was have a sheet of paper, have a sticky note, whatever it is, and write down a couple of general topics that you're struggling with in terms of content. And that way I would just put it in somewhere that I could see it. And if I had spare time, I would go ahead and I would, watch a video, or I'd review my notes, review my study guide on that topic. So you don't always, studying does not mean that every single time you study for the MCAT, you have to sit down for, 10 hours at a time. That's not what that is, right? So you're going to have moments where, hey, I have 5 minutes. I can afford to do, a little bit of just review, refresh my memory. And so having that somewhere where you will see it frequently can be really helpful as well.
Yeah. Along the same idea of like understanding that like the stuff that you need to work on, like just to keep with the same example I used before, like if I missed an electrostatics question because I didn't know the equation, or I missed it because I knew the equation, but I didn't know which equation, that I didn't know that I was supposed to use that equation. Those are two different problems. the way you work on those is different, right? If you just don't know the equations, then you need to learn the equations. And so like videos and like taking notes and reading, all of that is super useful. But if your problem is you don't know, like I didn't know to use that equation, then you need to like practice using the equation. You need to practice like when and like recognizing like, oh, this sort of question, I use this equation. This sort of question, I use the other equation. And doing lots of practice questions. And so here we have two students that missed the same calculation question. That was an electrostatics calculation question. One of them is watching videos. The other student is doing practice questions. And those are separate problems and they require separate treatments. And that's why you have to get really granular and like go really like narrow when you're trying to figure out why did I miss this question, right? Don't just say, like, I missed it. I missed an electrostatics question. Like, why did you miss it? Was it a math error? Right? Like, was it data interpretation? Was it like kind of what exactly was it? Just kind of like another thing, like everything that we're talking about here is focusing on the questions, right? Each of the questions, why did you miss it? What should you have done differently? Reviewing yourself there. I also really like, even the students who are really good at that probably could gain some benefit from doing reviews of the passages and making sure that you understood everything that was in the passage, because there are passages where maybe you didn't understand how the experiment was set up, but you still got all the questions. And like, I do think it is important to make sure that you understand the passage in case there's a passage like it coming up in the future. Now, one of the main ways I like to like work on reviewing that passage is like I reread the passage when I'm reviewing, make sure I'm clear. If there's anything I'm kind of confused about, you can always go to like an office hours or like we do public webinars, come and bring questions, ask questions. And like, that's totally fine. I love to talk about that. If you're on the course, like we do office hours every week where we're just like, if you guys have questions, let's clarify something. But also I think it's useful to, when you finish reviewing the passage and finish reviewing the questions, take a step back and look at the questions in the passage together and say, okay, like here are the 5 questions that were in this passage. What parts of the passage were important for me to answer those questions? And you might find that like in this passage, like 2 of the questions were pseudo discretes and like didn't actually need the passage at all. 2 of the questions were about this figure, like figure 1, and then one of the questions was about the table. And that's a really common breakdown where it turns out in this entire passage, the only things that were really important was the table and the figure. And if all you understood was the table and the figure, you're good. And like, even if you didn't understand any of the words in the passage, any of the like 4 paragraphs. And I think that is really useful to do and do that for every passage, because over time, you're going to start to get a better understanding of what is it that the AAMC writers actually care about. There are times when I'm reading a passage and it's a passage I haven't seen before, and the moment I see a sentence, alarm bells go off in my head. And I'm like, that's going to be a question. And then it turns out that is a question. And that makes it so much easier to answer the questions when you know what the test writers care about. Like if they ever mention an amino acid in a passage, like highlight it, that's going to be a question. There are also like these little weird things. Like if a passage says like this protein is found in the liver, but not in the muscle, right? Like that sends off alarm bells, because this protein is probably not in a lot of places, but they went out of their way to tell me this is not in muscle. They're going to ask me a question about it. Like that's going to be a question. Then sure enough, it is a question. And so learning to identify how the exam writers are thinking and what it is that they care about will help you understand how you should be reading the passages, what stuff matters and what stuff doesn't, because every passage does have a good chunk of like fluff that you don't actually need to answer questions. But learning to identify that is really critical, especially if you want to get to that, like, 520s scores. Like you need to not just know all the content to be good at data analysis. You need to understand what are the test writers thinking? What do they care about? Because that's what I should be caring about.
Yeah, we're going to need an entire podcast for data analysis and figure interpretation. Yeah. So I always call those like buzzwords. And I know that, like you said, the moment I see those words, there's probably going to be a question about them. Mm-hmm. Just want to add on something else that, in addition to content that, gets tested often, or, ideas like it's localized in this place and not in this other place, are the notes at the end of a figure or table. The MCAT test writers, right? They don't have to draw your eye to anything in particular because you're expected to be able to read the passage, get the information you need out of the passage in order to answer the questions. But when they make a point of identifying specific information or those notes with figures, more often than not, they'll be useful for answering a question or knowing where to go back to, what part of the passage it relates to, etc. So keep an eye out for that. And we've talked about, this whole podcast is about reviewing a full length. This does not occur in a vacuum as a single point in time. You're going to use the information and the data that you've, obtained from reviewing this full length as you move forward, right? So are you making progress in the question types that you're missing? Are you making progress? You in the past on that last two, on the last two full lengths, you missed a lot of questions because you had, difficulty interpreting figures and you don't have your equations memorized, right? Two separate ideas, you approach them differently. But then in the next two full lengths, you're still running into the same issues. That's a moment where you say, okay, I'm not studying this type of mistake, or I'm not approaching my review of this type of mistake correctly. You go back and you assess, and then you change course as needed, right? So make sure that you're comparing not, necessarily the score, because like Phil mentioned, each exam tests different parts of the overall content bank that can get tested on the MCAT. But see, am I approaching my studying correctly, right? Am I making progress in terms of I've missed this a lot in the past. I'm not missing it anymore. Great. Now I know how to study this effectively versus I'm still making these mistakes. I need to troubleshoot.
Yeah. It's just that same idea of just constantly reviewing what could I be doing better? And is this working? Is it not working? And I think that is so critical. Just, trying to find your weak areas, trying to hit them, being aware of kind of what the problems are. I do want to point out that over the course of an exam, you're probably going to have a list of a lot of different things that you need to work on. And some of these different sections are different from each other. For example, cars, you're never going to miss a question because you didn't know something or because of a math error or because you didn't know which equation to use or you don't know your equations. Those aren't problems. So in the cars section, you need to be focused more on looking for patterns of why I'm missing these questions and how do I work on those. And so it might be that there are certain passages that you are struggling on. And this happens in the sciences as well. If you realize I did well on all these passages except for these passages on politics. And I missed there were two passages that were kind of political, historical. I did bad on both of them. So maybe there's something about that specific topic that is causing problems. Actually, a really common thing is a passage, someone will have a passage about something really complex, like linguistic relativity. And then there'll be a passage about viral videos. And then students will do bad on the passage about viral videos. And the reason they're doing bad on that passage is because they know something about viral videos. And so if you zoom out and look and see, okay, I'm really, it's not certain types of questions, it's certain types of passages that I'm doing bad on. And if you realize those are the two passages I felt the most confident about, maybe that's my problem. Maybe I feel comfortable. And so I'm just pulling stuff from my own head to answer questions because I know about viral videos. I'm an expert in them. I just spend all my days watching cat videos on YouTube. And so you feel like you can bring some stuff to the table and answer questions. And maybe that's your problem. Or maybe you're missing questions throughout the cars section. In which case, it's probably not certain types of passages. It might be certain types of questions. And the way that you are thinking about that question type is different. So if I see this kind of question, I need to tackle that kind of question differently than how I'm currently tackling it. Because there are different types of questions, and you do need to be able to tackle them differently because they're not all the same. And a strategy that's good for one question type might hurt you on another. And so wanting to identify different types of questions, wanting to identify what types of wrong answers you're tempted by. So in cars, me personally, my personal Everest battle to fight was bringing in outside information. I would constantly bring in outside information, especially if the passage was about a topic that I knew something about. It was a passage about religion or evolution or healthcare or disease, right? I know something about that. And so it's really easy for me to bring in outside information. And the MCAT writers know that I know about healthcare. And so they set those traps for you. And then I would fall for them every time. I my CAR score was pretty bad for the first several months of my prep until I figured that out. The way that I figured that out was reviewing. I went back through 2 exams, just reviewed, and I realized like 70% of the questions I'm missing, I'm just going out of scope. Just identifying that made it so that anytime in the future when I'm torn between 2 questions, I'm like, all right, or torn between 2 answers, I'm like, is one of these out of scope? Yeah, that one's out of scope. This is the answer. And so it was about knowing who I was and my tendencies that helped me avoid those. But you can't avoid those unless you recognize and figure that out. And so note that it's not just in the sciences, it's not just content, but is it certain types of questions? Is it certain thought processes? Is it certain types of wrong answers that kind of pull you in? And I think that needs to be addressed. And that's why this reviewing portion is so big and why we're spending like a whole like lesson talking about review your exams super well, because that's how you get the growth. That figuring that out about myself in cars made my car score go up 5 points over the course of a week. And then it kept going up because I found out what my problem is. Now, your problem might not be that. And so I think that's a challenge that comes with a lot of people that are teaching test prep. They want, like they say, like a lot of times you'll run into somebody else and they'll say like, oh, just do a load of exams and that'll help. If your problem is timing and endurance and data interpretation, doing lots of exams will help. If your problem is content, that won't help, right? If your problem is math errors, that won't help. And so understanding like what you specifically need to work on and diagnosing that and then hitting those is of the utmost important. And that's why we advocate doing this. And also, just as a side note, I wouldn't like, I kind of gave my schedule, like Saturday exam, Sunday, Monday review, up to Thursday, hit your weak areas, Friday off. I wouldn't try to do more exams. Like the fastest I would ever advocate a student to do is like maybe an exam every 5 days. And that's if they are really good. Like they're in the 520s and they don't need to review that much. For normal mortals, I think like doing like once a week is probably kind of the ideal schedule. Every once in a while I'll come across a student who's like, I'm on spring break. I'm going to take 5 exams this week. And I'm like, that's not a good idea. And I think that is something to be aware of. A lot of students will do lots of exams, but they're not reviewing it. And the reviewing it takes time. And then hitting those weak areas takes time. If you're not doing those things, you're not improving. And like the exams themselves are not the teaching thing, where you see the growth. They're the diagnostic tool. And so they should help you figure out how to treat.
Yeah. And if we have not, if we've only convinced you of one thing during this podcast, hopefully it is of the importance of reviewing your full lengths. So keeping in mind, right, full lengths, you're diagnosing your difficulties. You're going to use the data that you obtain from reviewing your exam carefully, thoroughly, right, to figure out how you're going to review your areas of weakness, breaking those habits of falling for traps. And then just keeping in mind that this is the pace at which you take these exams, the pace at which you review is individual, right? So keep all of this in mind as you go ahead, move forward. When you start taking full lengths and when you start reviewing them, we will be here to guide you through the rest of your MCAT journey. We are excited to do so. And just keep in mind, subscribe, come back. That way you can get notifications for when we're here and when our weekly podcast goes up. And then just stay tuned. We have a lot of exciting topics coming up.